This story, titled My Wife's Confession, begins with a man named Paul. He's 52 years old, married to his wife Diane for 27 years. Paul's a man of routine. He wakes up at the same time every day, makes his coffee just the way he likes it, and spends the evenings on the back porch of their modest suburban home, reflecting on a life he's always thought was steady and reliable. Paul's life wasn't perfect. Whose is? But it was familiar. And familiarity is comforting, isn't it? Paul and Diane had raised two kids together, both of whom had moved out and were living lives of their own. Their relationship had mellowed over the years, settling into what Paul thought was a quiet but unshakable bond. At least, that's what he thought, until a single conversation turned everything he believed about his marriage upside down. It started on a Tuesday evening. Paul remembers this detail clearly because Tuesdays were always their catch-up night. After dinner, they'd sit in the living room, Diane with a glass of wine, Paul with his black coffee, and they'd talk. It was a ritual Paul cherished, one of those little things that kept them connected in a world that sometimes felt too fast-paced for their liking. But that night, Diane seemed different. She was quieter, almost hesitant. "Is something wrong?" Paul had asked, his brow furrowing as he leaned forward, studying her face. Diane looked at him, her blue eyes clouded with an emotion he couldn't place. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, but Paul noticed the way her fingers gripped the stem of her wineglass. She was nervous. Paul's heart skipped a beat. In that moment, 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. Was she sick? Was it the kids? Had something happened that she hadn't told him about? "I've been fantasizing about someone else," Diane admitted, her words cutting through the air like a blade. For a moment, Paul didn't speak. He couldn't. The weight of her confession was so unexpected, so jarring, that it felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. "Fantasizing?" he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Diane nodded, her gaze fixed on the wineglass in her hand. "It's nothing serious," she added quickly, as though that would soften the blow. "It's just harmless thoughts. I didn't want to keep it from you, Paul. I thought you deserved to know." But Paul didn't feel like he deserved to know. In fact, he wished she hadn't told him at all. Her words echoed in his mind, over and over again. Fantasizing about someone else. "Who?" he asked, his voice sharper now, tinged with a mix of anger and desperation. Diane hesitated, and that hesitation was like a punch to Paul's gut. "It's not anyone you know," she said finally. "Just someone I see occasionally. A man at the coffee shop I go to. I don't even know his name." That should have been a relief, shouldn't it? It wasn't a close friend, not someone from their circle. But it wasn't a relief. Not at all. Because the details didn't matter. What mattered was that, for the first time in their marriage, Diane's thoughts were straying from him. Paul stood up, pacing the living room as he tried to process what he'd just heard. His mind was a whirlwind of questions. Why was she telling him this now? Was it truly harmless, or was this her way of preparing him for something more? Was their marriage not enough for her anymore? "Paul, please," Diane said, her voice breaking as she watched him. "I don't want this to come between us. It doesn't mean anything. I swear, it doesn't." But it did mean something to Paul. It meant everything. Because Diane had always been his anchor, the one person he could count on no matter what. And now, he felt like he didn't know her at all. That night, Paul barely slept. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying Diane's words over and over. He tried to convince himself that it wasn't a big deal, that everyone probably had fleeting thoughts about someone else at some point. But the more he tried to rationalize it, the more it ate away at him. By morning, Paul knew he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't just pretend everything was fine. But he also didn't know what to do. Should he confront Diane again, demand more answers? Or should he bury his feelings, try to move past it for the sake of their marriage? Over the next few days, Paul found himself scrutinizing everything. Every time Diane glanced at her phone, he wondered if she was thinking about the man at the coffee shop. Every time she laughed at something, he questioned if it was a laugh meant for him, or for someone else, even if only in her mind. And then something happened that added another layer to Paul's growing unease. One afternoon, while he was running errands, he decided to stop by the coffee shop Diane frequented. He told himself it was innocent curiosity, that he just wanted to see the place for himself. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He wanted to see if he could spot the man Diane had mentioned. As Paul walked into the coffee shop, his eyes immediately scanned the room. It was a cozy place, with warm lighting and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. There were a few people sitting at tables, typing away on laptops or chatting quietly. And then, Paul saw him. At least, he thought it was him. There was a man sitting near the window, a book in his hands and a cup of coffee in front of him. He was tall, with dark hair and an easy smile that seemed to come naturally. Paul felt a pang of something he couldn't quite describe. Jealousy, maybe, or insecurity. He didn't know this man, but he hated him already. Paul didn't stay long. He didn't want to risk Diane finding out that he'd been there. But as he left the coffee shop, he couldn't shake the image of the man from his mind. Was this the person his wife was fantasizing about? And if so, what did that mean for their marriage? Back at home, Paul felt a growing sense of resentment. It wasn't just about the man at the coffee shop. It was about the fact that Diane had kept this from him for so long. How many times had she sat across from him at the dinner table, pretending everything was fine, while secretly harboring thoughts about someone else? And yet, despite his anger, Paul couldn't bring himself to confront her again. Part of him was afraid of what she might say. What if she admitted that her feelings were deeper than she'd let on? What if she confessed that she wasn't happy in their marriage anymore? Days turned into weeks, and Paul found himself sinking deeper into his own thoughts. He started to question everything. His own worth, their relationship, even his sense of identity. He wondered if he was being unreasonable, if he was letting his insecurities get the best of him. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't let it go. And then, one evening, Diane came home later than usual. She offered a vague explanation about a meeting running long, but Paul couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story. Was she really at a meeting, or had she been at the coffee shop, talking to the man she'd been fantasizing about? Paul's mind was a storm of emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion. He didn't know what to believe anymore. All he knew was that the life he'd thought was so steady, so reliable, was now filled with doubt, and he had no idea how to find his way back to the life he'd known before Diane's confession. Paul found himself sinking further into a spiral of doubt and self-reflection. He began to question every interaction with Diane, analyzing her tone, her glances, her words, searching for clues. It wasn't just about her confession anymore. It was about what it meant for their entire marriage. Had their bond always been this fragile? Or had he simply been blind to the cracks forming over the years? One evening, a particularly quiet one, Paul decided he couldn't live in limbo any longer. He needed clarity. It was exhausting to wake up each day feeling as though his life had been turned upside down. He walked into the living room where Diane sat, engrossed in a novel. The sight of her, so at ease, so seemingly normal, almost made him stop in his tracks. But he pressed on. "Diane, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. She looked up, startled. "Of course, what's on your mind?" "What you told me." He began, sitting across from her. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I need to understand why you told me. Why now?" Diane set her book down and took a deep breath. "Paul, I told you because I didn't want to keep anything from you. I thought honesty was the best way to handle it. But do you understand what it's done to me?" Paul asked, his voice cracking slightly. "I can't stop thinking about it. About him. About you, and what this means for us." Diane looked genuinely pained. "I never meant to hurt you," she said softly. "I thought sharing it would bring us closer, not tear us apart." Paul ran a hand through his thinning hair, frustration mounting. "But why were you fantasizing about someone else in the first place? Was I not enough for you? Were we not enough?" Tears welled up in Diane's eyes, and she looked away for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "It's not about you, Paul," she said finally. "It never was. I think I've just been feeling stuck. Not with you, but with life. Our routine, our predictability. And when I saw him, it wasn't about him as a person. It was about the idea of something different, something new." Paul sat in stunned silence. Her words cut deeper than he expected. "So I'm just boring to you?" he asked bitterly. "No, Paul," Diane said quickly, reaching for his hand. "You're my partner, my best friend, the love of my life. But even the strongest bonds can feel stagnant sometimes. It doesn't mean I don't love you, or that I want anyone else. It just means I'm human. We're human." Paul pulled his hand away, not out of anger, but because he needed space to think. He wanted to believe her. He really did. But her confession had opened a Pandora's box of insecurities he didn't know he had. The next day, Paul decided to take a step back and reflect on his own feelings. He went for a long drive, something he hadn't done in years. As he drove through the winding back roads of their small town, memories flooded his mind. He thought about the early days of their relationship, their first date, their wedding, the birth of their children. He thought about the countless nights they'd spent talking, dreaming, and building a life together. But he also thought about the ways they drifted, the conversations they no longer had, the intimacy that had faded over time. Maybe Diane wasn't the only one who felt stuck. Maybe he'd been feeling it too, but he hadn't allowed himself to admit it. When Paul returned home, he found Diane sitting on the porch, her face etched with worry. She looked up as he approached, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. Then Paul spoke. "I've been thinking," he began. "About us, about everything you said." Diane nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I realized something," Paul said. "I've been so focused on how your confession made me feel that I didn't stop to think about why you felt the need to confess it in the first place. Maybe we've both been stuck. Maybe we've both been so caught up in the routine of our lives that we forgot to nurture what we have." Diane's eyes filled with tears, and she reached for his hand. "I don't want to lose us, Paul," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to lose you." Paul squeezed her hand, a small but significant gesture. "I don't want to lose us either, but if we're going to move forward, we need to be honest with each other. Completely honest. About everything." Diane nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. "I'm ready," she said. Over the next few weeks, Paul and Diane embarked on a journey of rediscovery. They started going on dates again, something they hadn't done in years. They talked about their dreams, their fears, and the things they wanted to change. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt and pain, but they were committed to rebuilding their relationship. One evening, as they sat on the porch together, Diane turned to Paul and said, "Thank you for not giving up on us." Paul looked at her, the woman he'd loved for so many years, and felt a renewed sense of hope. "Thank you for being honest," he replied, "even when it hurt, because it reminded me of how much I care about what we have." Their journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Paul felt like they were facing those challenges together, and that made all the difference. If this story resonates with you, take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe. Share your thoughts below. Have you ever faced a moment in your relationship that forced you to confront hard truths? I'd love to hear your story. Until next time, keep listening, keep reflecting, and keep growing.